C'est la communication de Mohamed Daoudi, professeur d'anglais à l'Université Hassan de Casablanca, qui va nous parler des pilotes américains engagés sur le front de la guerre du Rif, avec notamment un point sur l'escadrille de la Garde Chérifienne. Donc, je vais demander à Mohamed là aussi de bien vouloir respecter la vingtaine de minutes, et je lui cède la parole immédiatement.
Merci beaucoup. Donc, peut-être je tiens à remercier toutes les personnes et institutions. Oh. Vous m'entendez? Non? Ok. Donc, je tiens à remercier les personnes et les institutions qui ont rendu cet événement possible. Je remercie surtout Aurélia et Karima pour leur assistance durant les semaines passées. Dans ma communication, je vais un peu élargir ou étendre la perspective transméditerranéenne, France-Maroc, France-Espagne et Maroc, vers une perspective plus large, transatlantique.
I'm sure this is going to be a very worthy successor to the 1973 colloque, which is the book that inspired my interest in the Reef War.
Une communauté américaine assez considérable quand même, surtout à Paris. Et donc, ma communication traite d'un sujet qui lie ces deux rives de l'Atlantique. Rappelons qu'une partie des aviateurs américains vivaient à Paris déjà en 1925. Donc, je vais parler en anglais. Alors, the participation of American aviators in the Reef War as members of an air unit called l'Escadrille de la Garde Chérifienne is a chapter of the war which, although has begun to draw interest in recent years, most of what is being published reproduces some of the inaccuracies, generalizations, and blanks that have become common to writings about the subject. And I can think here of most, if not all, the works that have mentioned the subject, known books like Fourneau and David Woolman, but also more recent ones like Courcelles-Labrousse and Nicolas Marmier, including also the two main articles published on the subject, which are by Moroccan scholar Mustafa Azzou and American military historian William Dean. All these reproduce to me some of the same errors that people that are very common in the research on the subject. I will summarize these inaccuracies and blanks in three main points. There are others, of course, but I will talk about mainly three. Number one, the erroneous association of the Sherifi and Escadrille with the famous Escadrille Lafayette of World War I, which is totally a false association. Two, the inaccurate membership lists of the Sherifian squadron, both in names and numbers. So different names and numbers are suggested. Azzou, for example, mentions in his article 10 members. Names also vary and often include World War I veterans like Majors William Rogers of Pittsburgh, Paul Frank Bayer, Charles Craig, and Joseph Sterling of Brooklyn, when none of these four was a member of the Lafayette nor of the Escadrille Chérifienne. Three, and this is to me the most important one, the total absence of a history of the missions of the Escadrille, the war missions that is, and the geography of these missions, and the significance of the military role of the squadron or its lack thereof. This paper is part of an ongoing project of historical reconstruction that aims at filling some of these gaps in the research on the Sherifian squadron. Some of the sources I have used include a book-length manuscript by Colonel Paul Ayers Rockwell about his experience in Morocco as a member of the Escadrille, which is, to my knowledge, the only existing memoir of its kind. I was generously given access to the manuscript by his late son, Dr. Kenneth Rockwell. Also, very extensive research has been done into the American newspapers' reports and dispatches of the period. We can here distinguish between two types of journalists, American journalists, that is, those we call today embedded journalists, that is, journalists who go with the troops. And in this case, they mostly reported from Wizan, Fez, and Rabat. such as Floyd Gibbons of the Chicago Daily Tribune and Carl von Wiegand of the Hearst Papers, and who actually, von Wiegand, flew with the Escadrille from Paris to Rabat. I have to admit, though, that research in the papers of Carl von Wiegand at the Hoover Institution archives at Stanford University did not yield much as far as the Garde Chérifienne is concerned. On the other hand, there's the only American journalist, and this is the second type of journalist, who reported from the other side, that is the RIF, and that was Vincent Sheehan, a correspondent for the North American Newspaper Alliance, which is a kind of a large newspaper syndicate incorporating papers like the Washington Post, the LA Times, and the Baltimore Sun. Now, let me move to the formation of the squadron, which, looking at the circumstances of this formation, will explain many of the errors and the widely held misconceptions about the squadron. The idea of forming a squadron of American veterans of the Great War to volunteer in the service of France to fight in the RIF was started by Charles Sweeney, a Foreign Legion veteran, World War I Foreign Legion veteran, and a cadet at West Point. That is, he didn't finish his training at West Point Military Academy, and who had previously fought in other wars. He fought, for example, with Francisco Madero in Mexico, with the Poles against the Bolsheviks in 1920. Sweeney wrote to fellow veterans of the World War I, inviting them to join a unit in the making. His telegram to Paul Rockwell reads as follows: propose reforming Lafayette Escadrille, service Morocco, have half dozen old members already lined up. Would like you to join. In trouble, get pen, accept idea. Can you suggest influential persons might see? Before even receiving confirmation of any kind or any reply, Sweeney had already leaked the news to the press with names of potential members and exaggerated accounts of their exploits in World War I. The fact is that not all of them had flying experience to begin with, including the commander Sweeney and Rockwell himself. More importantly, as Rockwell recalls in his memoir, none of the listed veterans had ever belonged to the Lafayette Escadrille or had shot down a German airplane. It was evident that both the French press and Sweeney and some of his aviators intentionally encouraged this Lafayette myth. In order to get around the law that obliges any foreigner to enlist in the Legion, in the army, if he wishes to serve in the French army, the squadron was attached to serve nominally in the army of the Sultan of Morocco. In fact, the Escadrille was the only foreign unit created during the war. At the reception of the Escadrille members in Paris, Premier Painlevé said that the Americans would fight, quote, to defend the cause of the peaceful Moroccan population placed under the authority of the Sultan, end quote. The trip of the aviators to Morocco wasn't a totally organized trip either. Members joined at different times until they reached 17 in all in September. Here, we can distinguish between three groups. First was Sweeney's group, flying on August the 5th from Paris to Rabat via Marseille, Barcelona, Alicante, and Malaga. They had stops in these cities, with even attended a corrida in Malaga at their honor. The group included Captains Lanson Holden of New York, Major Granville Pollock of Fort Worth. These are two of the most important pilots with flying experience. So Pollock is from Fort Worth, Texas. Second was the group that sailed from Marseille aboard the Anfa on August the 6th and reached Casablanca on August the 9th. This group included Paul Rockwell and James Vincent Sparks of Indianapolis, Indiana. Third, so there are two groups that went together. One was composed of roughly 8 people, the other of 4. And third is a miscellany of individuals who came to Morocco on their own, namely Schuyler Cousins of Louisiana, who was a former New Orleans Reserve Officer Corps of the United States, and who became a portrait painter and opened a studio in Marseille. Victor Pennington of Hillington, Maryland, who flew from New York to Casablanca and joined the Escadrille in early September, that is, after the beginning of the campaign. The last one to join the group in the middle of the campaign was Curtis Day of Paxton, Illinois, the Chicago Tribune reports that he landed in Ben Ahmed Aviation Field straight from the United States on Monday, the 21st of September, of course. We can see how the initial circumstances of the formation of the squadron had an element of improvisation in them, which, together with the differences in times and locations of departure and arrival, explains the inaccuracy of names, numbers, and other details that were reproduced in press accounts and diplomatic cables. And these inaccuracies persisted even after the end of the campaign. This is further complicated, especially at the level of archived documents, by the fact that the American aviators did not sign any enlistment papers, nor did they take any oath of allegiance to France or to the Sultan, and that in order to avoid diplomatic and political complications. Now, of the 17 members, 16 Americans actually, and 1 Canadian, 15 were directly involved in the bombing campaigns in the Rif. In the Jbala, I would say, because, and I'll come to that later, there was no bombing inside the Rif proper. Since the Canadian, 15, the Canadian Walter Susan from Ottawa, one of the most decorated among the group, was assigned motor reparation tasks because of a head wound that made flying dangerous for him. Also excluded was Lieutenant Colonel Charles Kerwood of Bryan Moore, Pennsylvania, who got injured when he crash landed his plane during training before even going to the front. So these 2 were excluded, and we end up with 15. Kerwood was sent to hospital in Casablanca, where he was recovering for days. Kerwood afterwards claimed he was a kind of spokesperson or liaison officer for the Escadrille, and went around giving interviews to journalists, although it was, as Rockwell recounts, a self-bestowed title, according to him. Kerwood's statements to the press were full of pompousness, exaggerations. So of the remaining 15 members, some took part in the Rif operations as pilots, like Holden and Pennington, while others were observers, which practically also means bombers, that is, bomb throwers, if so to speak, such as Sparks, Sweeney, and Rockwell himself. Now, the motives. What are the motives of these people to join the French war effort? Now, the French authorities obviously welcomed the idea and found it extremely useful for propaganda purposes. But what were the motives of these aviators themselves? As far as the pay is concerned, because people usually call them mercenaries, but if we look at the pay, it wasn't really that interesting. Rockwell mentions that they were paid about $1 a day, which is somewhat confirmed by Curtis Day in a letter to David Woolman, when he says that he was paid the equivalent of $40 a month. This modest pay, to me, clearly rules out. They also denied that they were seeking adventure. The motive that these aviators unanimously alleged was their love of France and their conviction that France was on the right side in this war. 2 testimonies by Rockwell and Cousins reflect the reasons behind the enlistment of the Americans in the service of France. For Rockwell, Russian communists, Germans, and French Reds were, quote unquote, showering upon Abdelkrim all kinds of aid and encouragement. He says, quote, I had no special animosity against the Riffians or grudge against their religion, and even sympathized with their desire to manage their own affairs. But whatever might be said for Abdelkrim and the Riffian cause, he was backed by the wrong people. His victory would have been also a victory for the communists. Now, of course, Rockwell comes from a very conservative South Carolina family, and he was typical conservative, American conservative, who's actually, in one of his interviews he gave years after that, decades, 60s, I think, he was actually, one of his interesting views was that he was against the famous Supreme Court law in 1954, Brown against versus the Board of Education, which was a blow to segregation. Lieutenant Schuyler Cousins told Floyd Gibbons in a cafe in Loudeya in Rabat that he locked up his studio. Remember, this was a portrait painter, and sailed from Marseille to Casablanca not because he was seeking excitement or adventure. Adding, quote, "It might sound funny these materialistic days, but I believe the French stand in Morocco is right, and I want to help them. Abdelkrim has old German officers paid in Russian gold. I'm against Prussianism and Bolshevism. I know they say France is militaristic, but I believe both the white man and Moor, Christian and Mohammedan, would be safer in North Africa under French protection than under the dictatorship of Krim." Krim was the name usually used in the press instead of Abdelkrim, American press. Under the dictatorship of Krim with his Prussian advisors and Moscow check-in account. That is why I'm here. Sheehan, writing about the 4 American aviators he met in Tangier towards the end of the campaign, around 11th November, and these 4 were Mustaine, Pollock, Ferrand, and Bullen. There was no question of mercenary motives or frivolity, and adds that their strongest motive was the love of France. Quote, "They entered their present adventure under the impression that Abdelkrim has an escadrille of modern planes with good German aviators." Of course, a totally false impression, but one which explains a lot. Sheehan adds, quote, "Whether all the American group are like these 4, I am unable to say." There was clearly a mix of idealism, faith in the good deeds of la mission civilisatrice, and ignorance also among the aviators. When Victor Pennington, a graduate of the University of Maryland and Cornell in engineering, read about the formation of the squadron in the papers, he immediately resigned his job as an instructor in an engineering firm in New York, and flew to Morocco at his own expense. He told Rockwell that he, quote, "always wanted to do something to help France." And he also had a grudge against the Riffians because of their activities against Americans during Barbary pirate days. Rockwell, by way of anecdote, mentions, for example, that one of the members who sailed with him from Marseille to Casablanca aboard the Anfa was happy to be going to the land of al-Khayyam. Another wanted to buy a map of South Africa so he could see where Morocco was located. It becomes clear that the association of the Riffian struggle with Germans and Bolsheviks in colonial propaganda, often reproduced in the American press, was instrumental in the decision of the American veterans to enlist. In a very long article on Sweeney's enlistment in the New York Times, Stuart Emery claims that 15,000 veterans of the defeated European armies have joined the troops of Abdelkrim. And this explains why within the last few weeks, there has been a sudden and amazing rallying to the opposite tricolor. Now, I come to the 4th point, which is to me very important because it's totally lacking in other writings, but also because trying to reconstruct the history of the Escadrille's war operations and missions is important for a more valid assessment of its role in the war, in order not to fall either in minimizing that role or exaggerating it. And I think a little of that exaggeration occurs, for example, in Courcelles-Labrousse, in William Dean. There's some exaggeration as to the actual effect or role of the squadron in the war. Here, a number of complications arise. First, throughout the campaign, the American aviators often flew alongside pilots of the French escadrilles, especially the 4th Escadrille and the 13th Escadrille, often sharing or exchanging aircraft and men. Of course, these escadrilles were in the Beni Mellek airfield in the area of Ouezzane. And that's where the American raids usually took off or started. This makes it difficult at times to distinguish between bombings effected by French aviators and those executed by American aviators. Second, as soon as the initial propagandistic zeal over the formation of the squadron in France subsided, the French press was no longer interested in reporting the actions of the squadron. This is something also the American ambassador Herrick in Paris writes to Secretary of State Kellogg telling him that there was this big hit at the beginning, but then nothing is in the press. So that's why even Herrick, the ambassador himself, makes mistakes in listing the names of the actual members of the squadron, which is interesting even after the campaign. This was a telegram, I think, on the November the 12th or something around that. I can't remember exactly. Third, the third complication here is that in both Rockwell's memoir, which is quite informative in this regard, and the American newspaper reports, the geographical areas being targeted are often either nameless or too generally and vaguely identified, sometimes also misspelled. For example, at one point, Rockwell simply mentions the target of one of the missions as the headquarters of the Jbala. In any case, the available sources lead us to conclude that the field of activity of the American Escadrille, geographically speaking, extended along the western part of the border between the Spanish and French protectorate zones, but with considerable incursions into Spanish territory or Spanish zone. The areas targeted include Schoen and its surroundings, the sector of Wazan, the areas on the eastern part of the Lucus River, and north of Warra, especially the east of Warra. These are the four main zones that I have found were targeted by the Americans. The other major sector targeted by the bombing of Schoen, for example, was the first mission entrusted to the American squadron as a group on August the 5th. Obviously, there were missions before that, but the Americans in this case flew with French pilots. They did not go as an American group. The first mission or raid as an American group took place on August the 5th, and Schoen was the target. But the raids on the city multiplied afterwards, either because it was thought to be the center for the armed smugglers, according to Rockwell, or which was obviously not true, or because Mohamed Abdelkrim's brother was reported to be there. The bombs used, according to Rockwell's memoir, were usually 50-kilo bombs. Sometimes 10-kilo bombs were used, but in the case of Schoen, it was usually 50-kilo bombs. Rockwell recounts how in these raids, James Sparks, who was, by the way, studied dentistry and was a dentist, James Sparks' precision and effectiveness landing the bombs in the middle of the city of Schoen earned him the nickname the bombing butcher. Rockwell himself calls him the death-dealing dentist. Rockwell comments on his own bomb drop-in thus, quote, "My sensations were mixed. I had started out almost sick at having to do such work, but once over the city, it became a matter of pride to place the bombs effectively." One of the most important missions entrusted to the Escadrille in the first half of September was the bombing of Tarzout in the area of Schoen, north of Schoen actually, which was the headquarters for Mohamed, Abdelkrim's brother. The other major sector targeted by the Americans was north of Warra, especially during the third week of September, one of the most active periods in the campaign by the squadron, during which the aviators bombed the villages along the Wadaudur. So Rockwell doesn't actually misspells the name greatly, but it's the villages along the Wadaudur, one of the tributaries lying to the northeast of Warra. The New York Herald reports on September 22nd that the squadron has flown a total of 80 hours in the last 5 days and have dropped 9 tons of bombs and fired several thousand rounds from their machine guns against the Riffians. As many as 8 planes have participated in a single raid. The number of planes usually was between 7 and 9 American French brigade planes, obviously. Rockwell describes the area as the most active zone he'd been in and the one in which the bullets of the Riffian shooters came closer. The Herald and the Tribune describe the effects of the raids on the landscape as follows, quote, "Scores of plantations north of the Warra River, which only last year were flourishing and prosperous, are today blackened heaps of ashes." Other missions include the frequent bombardment of the villages east of the Lucus River, such as Bni Mohammed, where again 50-kilo bombs were used, The relief of Bougnous Fort, 10 kilometers northeast of Ouessant, which took several days and was completed on September the 26th, and the bombing of Refsey, which Rockwell undertook at least on 3 different occasions, each with a different American aviator or pilot. But not only groups of people who, by the way, always happened to be warriors and combatants in Rockwell's account, were targeted. Also farms, livestock, and markets. The orders the American aviators had were, quote, always bomb or machine gun livestock wherever found in enemy territory. The justification for such a tactic was very much in typical dehumanizing fashion. Quote, we were told that what the warring tribesmen most disliked was to have their flocks and herds slaughtered. They could marry new wives and beget new children, but cattle and sheep and goats represented years of toil and rapine. An experience had taught the French that one of the quickest ways to bring the dissident tribes to terms was to wipe out their herds. Now, what were the effects of these raids on the ground? The aviators' accounts, including Rockwell's, reflect the detached perspective of an aviator sitting in his deck. As Rockwell recalls, quote, I saw gray clouds of smoke and dust and debris arise each time I dropped my bombs, but the motor made so much noise I could not hear the explosion or tell how much damage I had done, end quote. It resembles what Carl von Wiegand, the Hearst journalist, called the box seat, describing his privileged position watching with his field glasses a battle in the Ouessant sector from a distance safely behind French tanks and native African troops. A closer perspective on the damage done on the ground can be glimpsed from the reports by Sheehan, the only journalist who was in the RIF at the time. Sheehan was in Schoen and not only witnessed, but was exposed to the bombardment by the Escadrille 3 times. In his report, he says, quote, the population of Schoen is completely non-combatant. Women, children, old men, Jews, holy men, and scribes. There was also a hospital. There's no garrison in Schoen. Sheehan witnessed the killing of 150 to 200 by his estimation. Quote, the dead were exclusively non-combatants, he wrote. He later met 4 of the aviators in Tangier who told him, quote, they had bombarded Schoen that same morning. He met them again on the, I think, 11th of November. So they had bombarded Schoen that morning, flying exceedingly low and releasing more than 30 bombs over the city. Then they proceeded to Tetuan for lunch with the Spanish officers and came to Tangier for dinner. Samuel Mustaine of Yuma, Arizona said casually, what we can't understand is why nobody ever fires at us in Schoen. Every other place we have bombarded, we get heavy rifle fire. When I explained to them that Schoen was a completely non-combatant city and their victims always women, children, and old men, they all showed deep regret, end quote. Now, Sheehan's dispatches played an important role in intensifying the already critical attitude towards the aviators in public opinion in the US. This was reflected in newspaper editorials, readers' letters to the editor, and statements by politicians, including several senators and congressmen. The participation of the Americans in the bombing of the RIF was variously called, and I am quoting selectively here from a wide range of papers and statements, shameful, a disgrace, an unspeakably dirty business, a mistaken cause, a work of piracy and murder, a cowardly un-American warfare, a disgrace to civilization. Senator Irvine Lenroot of Wisconsin and member of the Senate Committee on Foreign Relations said, if the points enumerated in the reports are based on facts, now he mentions here a report published by the North American Newspaper Alliance, which was certainly based on dispatches by Sheehan. Sheehan was the only foreign journalist in the RIF at the time. And he actually writes about that in his personal history, his autobiography. It was mainly because he had the first trip in the RIF in January, which was very hazardous, and he had no pen, no notebook, nothing. So this time, in the second trip, he had to write down everything, and he sent the dispatches via Sidi Hassan, who was an Algerian attached as a secretary to Mohammed, Abdelkrim's brother, Sidi Hassan al-Qadiri Tilimsani. And so Tilimsani sent the dispatches via couriers to Tangier. And so these dispatches, these were the dispatches that the North American Newspaper Alliance based on in order to write its report, a set of conclusions that were widely circulated in the American press, the Baltimore Sun, the Los Angeles Times. Also, it found echoes very much in the African American press. So again, Senator Irvine LaRoute, as I said, of Wisconsin, member of the Senate Committee on Foreign Relations, said, quote, "If the points enumerated in the reports are based on facts, and I have no reason to believe otherwise, the behavior of these aviators is deplorable, to say the least. They are potential killers." Now, of course, this is a whole subject for investigation, which, of course, I will not have time to delve into in more detail. But let me just end with the opinion of one of the American residents of Paris, one of the eminent American residents of Paris, the novelist Ernest Hemingway, who incidentally was a friend with Sweeney, the commander of the squadron. And they were very close friends. Hemingway even admired Sweeney. But here, when Sweeney went to Morocco, Hemingway had expressed a kind of a brutal sarcasm on the incident. Let me read from his letter dated August 22nd, I believe, to Gertrude Stein. Hemingway says, this was at the time, or exactly during a week in which Hemingway and his wife were threatened of eviction from the apartment they lived in because the landlady wanted to raise the rent, and she threatened them that if they did not pay 100 francs, they should leave the apartment. So he was angry and furious. And it's funny and interesting how these personal preoccupations, merge with interests in international news. So Hemingway says in the letter, Charles Sweeney and a collection of former captains, majors, lieutenants, colonels off to fight the Rifts. Awfully sweet thing to do. But if you've got the Legion of Honor already, what's it all about? Can understand fighting for Abdelkrim against the French, although not attractive, but to deliberately go and fight for Cayo in Morocco, not for adventure or what's in it, no, for high moral purposes. You have to admit it is touching. What imbeciles the French must think we are. And aren't we, though? Oh, well, I should go and join the Mr. and Mrs. Seeger Escadrille to fight for Madame Chotard. This is the name of the landlady, Madame Chotard. So I should join the Escadrille to fight for Madame Chotard against Abdelkrim in his backyard. Now, these are just hints to the public opinion in the US, which is generally, of course, not hostile to this participation. And to conclude, what I have tried to do is sketch some of key aspects in the story of the Escadrille Chérifienne in the hope of telling a more accurate account than has hitherto been attempted. I believe that a fuller reconstruction of this history is necessary for a reliable assessment of its significance in the war, but also in the understanding of intersecting currents of colonial, cultural, and political influence in the interwar transatlantic and Mediterranean worlds. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup pour cette autre intervention très claire. On va du coup prendre le temps maintenant d'ouvrir le débat à la salle. Moi-même, puisque j'ai le micro